We've got to dig into this. Chris Lu served as an assistant to the president and White House cabinet secretary under President Obama. He's also a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Victoria Defrancesco is a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Susan Del Percio is a Republican strategist and an MSNBC political analyst. So, Chris, you're an Asian American, son of Chinese immigrants. Look, we know about the hostility toward undocumented immigrants, but we cannot forget. I want to reiterate what Peter just said. This was directed and is directed at people who are American citizens who just, happen to look different than most of Trump's base, Chris.
Yeah, this is disgusting. There's no other way to put it. As an Asian American who has spent his career in public service, I've certainly heard myself people say, go back to your country. I was born in this country. I've served this country. My family has served this country. And to have a president who would condone this kind of behavior and actually see it as a political strategy is nothing more. There's nothing you can say other than the fact that this is a disgusting strategy. And what's important to understand is this kind of conduct is not tolerated in any other setting. If you tried to do this in your workplace, you would be fired. If your child did this in his school, he would be sent home. And so we're long past the point of this president being a role model. But to try to use racism as a political strategy is just we've now gone to a brand new level, a brand new low in this country.
Susan, Breitbart's front page shows sort of where this is all going. The headline is Dragon Energy Returns. Explain that.
Scorched earth politics. This is despicable. What scares me even more, and I agree with everything that's been said, this is racist, bigoted, unacceptable behavior. But what scares me is when then candidate Trump came up with the Muslim ban, there was at least some outrage from Republicans. After Charlottesville, there was still some outrage from Republicans. Today, I hear crickets from elected
Well, let me
officials.
play for you. We just heard from Mitch McConnell, the leader, besides Donald Trump, the leader on Capitol Hill of the Republican Party. He tried to suggest that the rhetorical problem is with the Democrats, not with the president. Let me play what he just said.
You may not know this, your viewers may not know this, but I was there when Martin Luther King gave that I Have a Dream speech. I was there as an observer when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. Look, I've got nothing to apologize on this front. We ought to tone the rhetoric down across the country, throwing around words like racism, kind of routinely applying it to almost everything. Let's talk about the issues.
Yeah.
And the issues are, as we talked about in the first discussion here, where they want to take America. They want to take America into a socialist country.
His answer is that Democrats got to stop throwing around words like racism.
Mitch McConnell is a disgrace to the office he serves. He is a disgrace to this country. He should know better, and he should stand up. If he used his history of where he was, it is his obligation, not only as an elected official, but just as a citizen, to say what is right and what is wrong. And this is clearly wrong. And let me say something else, Chris. People ask me, why am I still a Republican? It's tough sometimes. But one of the things I'm here as a Republican for is because I will remember what happened, and I will make sure other people do not forget as they run for office after Donald Trump, because if you didn't speak out against these policies, you are against this country.
Victoria, the president's allies have tried to say this is all about ideology, or he's just mad at Congress. But I want to go back to touch on what Susan just alluded to. This is someone who was accused of anti-black bias as far back as the 60s. He started birtherism. He called Mexicans rapists. He went after a judge for his Mexican heritage. He called African nations S-hole countries. He put white supremacists on par with protesters in Charlottesville. So can we say this is a political strategy? Is it just Trump being Trump? Tell me your view on what we're seeing here over the last 12 hours or so.
Right. So not just over the last 12 hours, Chris, I think that over the last couple of years, we've seen a very concerted political strategy. Regrettably, there has always been a stream, this underbelly of racism in our country, sometimes more blatant, sometimes less so. Right now, we're in that blatant piece, and Trump knows this. And last night, we saw that on full display, where he was specifically targeting Representative Omar, who balls up up a lot of the things that his base is angry about all up into one. Anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, the extremity of the progressive left, of the crazy socialist left. So there's a very concerted strategy. And we know this, Chris, because yesterday Reuters came out with a poll showing that after the tweets were put out this weekend, Trump's approval among Republicans went up. The vast majority of Republicans in this poll did not see this as racist comments. And so there's a disconnect by what the president is saying, how Republicans are seeing it, and what Democrats are seeing. So I think for me, this is the most problematic, that it's not just Mitch McConnell, it's the Republican Party in general that doesn't see this as racist.
Chris, I want to read from the Associated Press. Quote, not since George Wallace's campaign in 1968 has a presidential candidate, and certainly not an incumbent president, put racial polarization at the center of his call to voters. So is this sustainable? What happens? Let's say if Kamala Harris or Cory Booker becomes the nominee.
Well, look, I think we're in uncharted territory right now. And what's important to understand, in 1968, George Wallace was running as a third-party candidate, not only to have a major party candidate and the President of the United States openly bragging about using this as a strategy is troubling. And I am troubled by those statistics as well about Republicans' approval for the president going up. That being said, I think what we saw in 2018, and hopefully what we see as a correction in 2020, is that there is a center, that the independents that Trump did win in 2016, that abandoned him in 2018, will be completely disgusted by these comments and by this strategy. And in particular, it's the suburban voters, those educated voters, the women who have been leaving the Republican Party in droves. This is not going to play well with them at all.
Then on the other side of this, Victoria, there have been people who are arguing, look, the Democrats have an awful lot of bark on this, but not necessarily a lot of bite. That last night when you watched the impeachment vote, you saw that less than 100 Democrats would get behind it. And there's been a lot of criticism about Republicans who have been silent or supportive in the face of racist attacks. But what about this sort of pragmatism of vulnerable Democrats and other Democrats, Politico, who did a whole article on it, who don't want to be painted as obstructionists? They say, look, we still have to do the job of the people. Are Democrats handling this correctly?
So, and this was actually Thomas Friedman's piece yesterday in the New York Times about the divide within the Democratic Party. There's a fissure. And this is something that President Trump, think what you may of President Trump, he is very smart when it comes to strategy, is exploiting that division. So he's trying to kind of make that more progressive base, fired up and running after him, which he then plays to his own Republican base, while the moderate Democrats, are painted as weak and not knowing what to do. So this fissure is very real. The optimist in me says the debates, the primary system is going to ultimately work its way out, and the Democrats will come together and find the best candidate to go up against Trump. But it is a little bit worrisome to see the severity of the divisions within the Democratic Party, because he is a formidable challenger. The economy is good, and he started off his rally touting how strong the economy is. Record low unemployment. So there's a big challenge. We can't just assume, oh, Trump, he's crazy, he's below 50% in his approval ratings. He is very strong, and, Vegas money would be on him getting reelected.
Yeah, one of the things he said last night, look, we're the party that's united. It's the Democrats who are divided. Mm-hmm. And, Chris, it wasn't even 2 weeks ago, Speaker Pelosi told Maureen Dowd that members of the squad essentially had no following, dismissing them essentially as just 4 votes. They've just got 4 votes like anybody else. Now they have this incredible national platform, and I wonder, will it make it harder for the party going ahead, the Democratic Party, to be united? Or might it actually backfire and bring what had been some fissures, bring the Democrats together?
Look, I think it might bring Democrats together, and I think I would rather be part of a party that has ideological divides than one that voted against a resolution that condemned the president with only 4 Republicans voting the other way. And so I think these ideological divisions are a good thing. And I think it's right. I think a lot of this will get sorted out, frankly, during the primary process.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.